My husband Bob and I are in our second year of marriage. I wasn't great at many things, but I was good at cooking. Your cooking is really delicious, he once said. That compliment on the lunch I made for our first date was what made me fall for him. After 6 months of dating, we got married, and I left my job to be a full-time housewife. My father-in-law passed away about a year ago, so now it's just my mother-in-law, Bob, and myself living together. I was hoping we could live alone as newlyweds, even for a short while, but I couldn't refuse when he said, "Mom's been feeling vulnerable since Dad passed away." Soon after we started our married life, I realized my mother-in-law didn't like me. I had seen bullies at my old job, but she was worse. She would always find fault with whatever I do. If I was doing the cleaning, she would point out every little spot that I missed and say, "What's this brown spot? Can't you see it?" Once she forced me to get the unremovable stain off the floor and made me wipe it. I wasn't allowed to stop until Bob came home from work. She would wake me up in the middle of the night and demand, "We're almost out of plastic wrap. Go and buy some now. Otherwise, I won't be able to sleep just by thinking about it." Since the grocery store was closed, I had to run to the closest convenience store. If I tried to wake Bob, she would explode in anger, saying, "How dare you wake your tired husband? House chores are the wife's job." So just to shut her up, I had no choice but to obey. These midnight calls were physically exhausting, but having my things thrown away or hidden was even worse mentally. "I don't know where your stuff is. Maybe you left it somewhere?" Whenever I couldn't find my belongings, she would say that. It's awful to blame others for your own mistakes. I can never forget how shocked I was when I found my favorite cardigan in the trash can a few days after. When I told Bob what happened, he just sighed heavily. "Well, you can just buy a new one," he said. I also tried in vain to persuade him to have a word with her. Not knowing what else I could do, I bought a safe with the money I'd saved before I married Bob. I kept my belongings out of her sight, especially my valuables, which I stored in the safe. It's crazy to distrust your own family like you do. I'd like to see the face of the person who raised you. Her harsh tone intensified, and every time she opened her mouth, I had to brace myself for the inevitable verbal attack. She would criticize every meal I cooked. Too bland, or no taste at all. When I tried making the taste stronger, she complained it was too spicy. I couldn't help asking my husband for his opinion on the taste, as I wasn't sure about my cooking skills any longer. "Mom has very strong food preferences. I think it's delicious," he said. Cooking, once a joy, became a chore. After a year of being bullied by my mother-in-law, I had an epiphany. My staying home all the time was the problem. Realizing this, I decided to start working part-time. I quit my job to be a housewife as requested by Bob when we got married, but if staying at home was this painful, I wouldn't have left it so easily. Despite a slight gap in my career, I was valued for my quick learning skills at my part-time job, and it simply felt good to be praised again. However, as I spent less time at home, my mother-in-law began to focus her harassment during breakfast and dinner times. She used to eat despite her complaining, but began leaving most of the food untouched, barely taking a bite before leaving the table. I can't even remember how many times she accidentally knocked over her soup bowl. When I swallowed my pride and asked her what was wrong with the meal, she'd laugh, saying, "You think asking will solve everything, don't you? Why don't you try thinking for yourself?" I was left alone to clean up her leftovers at the dinner table. But one day, my mother-in-law really crossed the line. While we were having dinner, she suddenly stood up, took her plate in her hand, and headed to the kitchen. As I looked up in surprise, our eyes met, and she smirked. "What?" By the time I realized what was happening, she had already thrown the meal I made into the trash can. "This is such an awful-looking meal. The dog food would even look better than this," she scoffed. I looked at Bob in disbelief, but he just ignored me and continued eating. I just couldn't believe what I saw, so I rushed to the trash can. I opened its lid and looked at the ruined food. "This is terrible." I turned around to see Bob, but he wouldn't even look at me. She probably wasn't feeling well. That was how he dismissed his mother's actions. How could she throw the food away right in front of the person who made it? As I became more upset, Bob scratched his head in annoyance and said, "Look, I have work tomorrow. Unlike you with your part-time job, I'm a full-time employee, working hard from morning to night. What's wrong with doing a part-time job? I work, cook at home, and then have my cooking thrown away by your mother. My voice broke with emotion, and he sighed deeply. Lisa, you're becoming a nag. Mom's probably irritated by your nagging too, you know. And if it's that bad, then you shouldn't be cooking anymore. After saying that, Bob walked into his bedroom, leaving me staring at his back in disbelief. I finally realized that he didn't care about me at all. Something inside of me just snapped. The next day, I prepared breakfast as usual and let both Bob and my mother-in-law know their breakfast was ready. Bob sat down to eat, but my mother-in-law grabbed her plate and said, "Not even a dog would eat this in the morning." Then she threw her breakfast in the trash can. Without a word, I stood up and took away the breakfast I prepared for Bob. What? I will have it. I quickly sat down and started eating his breakfast. I stopped reacting to my mother-in-law's actions and completely ignored how upset Bob was. Hey, why are you eating my breakfast? What are you doing? They both exclaimed. I looked at them innocently and replied. Well, since your mother said a dog wouldn't even eat this, you shouldn't be eating it. I will take responsibility for what I have made and eat it myself. No, I didn't say that. But you didn't deny what your mother said, did you? Bob opened his mouth but seemed unable to find anything to say. Lisa, stop talking nonsense and make Bob's breakfast. I looked straight at my mother-in-law with a smile. I'm very sorry that I have been serving you the sort of food that a dog wouldn't even eat. Don't worry, I won't cook for you ever again. I grabbed my knife and fork, finished eating breakfast, and stood up. Bob said, Wait, Lisa, what about my breakfast? Eat whatever you like. Then I left the house quickly. I usually return home around 5 p.m., but on that day, I had a few things to do after work. So by the time I got home, it was already past 8 p.m. Oh, you're very late. We've been waiting for you. Really, where on earth have you been? Bob and my mother-in-law complained, looking very hungry. Oh, haven't you two eaten yet? I already had my dinner. My mother-in-law's face turned red with surprise and anger. How dare you eat alone? Well, I did say I wouldn't cook for you anymore. Or were you looking forward to my terrible cooking? How dare you talk back to me like that? In frustration, she slammed the table, but then quickly regained her composure as she came up with a brilliant idea. If you're not cooking, then return the food money. Bob has been paying for all the living expenses, so you should pay him back every penny you spend on your food. I couldn't help but laugh at what she just confidently said. What's so funny? Since I started working part-time, I've been paying not just for food but all living expenses. It was Bob's suggestion. Bob said to me, Mom isn't happy about your working, but if you pay the living expenses, it might calm her down. It had been over a year since I started part-time work. That means I had been covering the living expenses for the last half of our married life. My mother-in-law, apparently unaware of this, looked shocked and turned to Bob. Is that true, Bob? Well, you wanted more pocket money, so... Bob, with a pitifully soft voice, making excuses. He had me provide the living expenses and use the extra money for his mother's allowance. You seem to have been spending quite a lot on extravagant meals. What? In the mailbox I found a flyer for regular customers at some lavish restaurant. I had thought my mother-in-law made her own lunch, but after seeing the flyer, I had a suspicion and found some receipts from that restaurant in a trash can. Shouldn't the proper thing be to pay back all the living expenses I've provided? After all, it was my hard-earned money. Don't worry, I'll be sure to bill you properly. With a full smile, I said to my mother-in-law, who was trembling with anger. Hey, what do you mean by billing? Bob, perhaps sensing something, turned pale and stood up. I want a divorce. And of course, I'll make sure I ask for alimony. Divorce. He muttered in shock, but soon realized something and brightened up. Do you think you can afford to live on your own with what you earn from your part-time job? He probably thought I would struggle financially. About that part-time job, I've been offered a full-time position. What? I've also decided where I live. My actual plan was to commute from my parents' home for a while, but what I said seemed to give him quite a shock. I'll get my lawyer to handle the proceedings from now on. Leaving those words behind, I went to my bedroom, grabbed the luggage I had packed the night before. Bob seemed to be in a state of shock and was still standing beside the dining table. I ignored and walked past him. Lisa, I'm sorry. I stopped and turned around. Sorry for what? What do you mean, what? It was hard to take sides between you and Mom. I never said anything bad about your cooking, did I? He doesn't understand anything at all. In the end, I truly realized I had been blind. It's not about taking sides. You chose to say nothing when the food being thrown away, and when I was being harassed by your mother over and over. Despite my pleas, you never helped me. Your playing the victim doesn't change the fact that you hurt me. I reproved him. Bob started crying bitterly, realizing the gravity of his sorrow. I quickly glanced at the pathetic man and headed towards the front door. As I reached for the door, my mother-in-law called out to stop me. I never intended for things to go this way. I just wanted to give you a little advice, although I admit it went too far at times. I was amazed at how oblivious she was to the severity of her actions. I've looked after you all these times, and it's disappointing that the last thing I hear from you is such an excuse-like response. From now on, you won't have to worry about being caught for spending a lot of money on delicious meals. My mother-in-law stood frozen, her eyes wide open, as if her breath had stopped. I returned to my parents' house. They warmly welcomed me as they were already aware of my situation. According to my lawyer, everyone in the neighborhood knew that my mother-in-law was incapable of household chores. Apparently, my father-in-law had managed the housework when he was still alive. After his passing, Bob, now my ex-husband, and his mother lived on takeaways and eating out. To them, I was a convenient housekeeper to exploit. The news about our divorce quickly spread throughout the town. Eventually, it was known to the bosses and colleagues of Bob, causing him considerable embarrassment. Bob and his mother are now in financial trouble, having hardly saved any money and squandering it all, and are panicking over the alimony they owe me. Now that everybody knows about their mistreatment of me, finding a new housekeeper has become impossible. They can't even afford the kind of meals they used to have. Bob, unrelenting, kept texting and asking me if we could get back together. I also received text messages from my mother-in-law, full of excuses, but they were repetitive and uninteresting, so I stopped reading them. Now, I enjoy cooking for my family, making sweets and baking cakes on weekends. I often share them with my colleagues. Surrounded by those who appreciate what I make, I believe that will help me restore my confidence in cooking. With this new hope, my heart swells with anticipation.